1776. A shy and absent-minded Scottish professor publishes a book of nearly 1,000 pages. The book is dense, sprawling, and in many stretches, frankly boring. But it contains an idea that will change the world. Adam Smith did not invent economics. But he gave it a name, a structure, and above all, a promise, that human societies obey laws as regular as those governing the planets. That promise attracted a brilliant banker, a pessimistic clergyman, and a handful of thinkers who, in barely 50 years, built an entire discipline from scratch. Today we meet the classical economists. The ideas they put on the table remain the foundation of everything that came after, including the fiercest criticisms leveled against them. Welcome to Part 11. So far we have traced the history of money, banks, inflation, markets, and crises. We have seen how an economy works. We have met some of the key thinkers, Adam Smith and his invisible hand in Season 5, Ricardo and comparative advantage in Season 7. But we mentioned them to explain concepts, not to understand their ideas as a system. Starting today, we enter the schools of thought. Each one was born in a specific historical moment, responding to real problems. Each one saw something the others missed. And each one has blind spots. We start at the beginning, with the classicals. You already know Adam Smith. In Season 5 we saw the pin factory, the division of labor, and the invisible hand. But Smith did something bigger than explain how markets work. He tried to build a complete theory of the wealth of nations. And that is where his thinking becomes truly interesting for the history of ideas. Smith did not merely observe that markets coordinate. He asked why. His answer was that economic growth depends on three things: the division of labor, the accumulation of capital, and the extent of the market. The more workers specialize, the more they produce. The more capital is invested in tools and machinery, the more efficient production becomes. And the larger the market, the more specialization it allows. This seems obvious today. It was not in 1776. Most earlier thinkers, the mercantilists, believed that a nation's wealth depended on how much gold it accumulated. Smith said no. Wealth was productive capacity, real goods and services, not precious metals. But there was something more subtle in Smith that is often forgotten: his theory of value. Smith distinguished between use value and exchange value, the famous paradox of water and diamonds. Water is essential for life but costs little. Diamonds are dispensable but cost a fortune. Smith did not manage to fully resolve this paradox. It would have to wait a century, for the marginalists, for a satisfactory answer. And let us remember something we have already seen: Smith was not the naive defender of the free market that many caricature. He warned against monopolies, business collusion, and the excessive power of merchants. For him, competition was the indispensable condition. Without competition, the invisible hand does not work. The next giant of classical economics was a very different sort. David Ricardo was born in 1772 to a family of Sephardic financiers from Amsterdam who had settled in London. He made himself extraordinarily wealthy on the stock exchange. And then, almost as a hobby, he set about solving economic problems. His most famous contribution is Comparative Advantage, which he published in 1817. The idea is counterintuitive, so it deserves a moment. Imagine that Portugal produces both wine and cloth better and more cheaply than England. By simple logic, Portugal should produce everything and England would have nothing to offer. Ricardo demonstrated that this is not the case. Even though Portugal is better at both things, it benefits from specializing in what it is relatively better at. If Portugal produces wine with far greater efficiency than cloth, it should focus on wine and import cloth from England, even though English cloth is objectively inferior. That is comparative advantage. It does not matter who is better in absolute terms. What matters is opportunity cost, what you give up when you devote your resources to one thing instead of another. This idea remains the theoretical foundation of international trade 200 years later. But it has an important weakness that the classicals themselves did not see clearly. The theory says all countries gain from trade, but it says nothing about how the gains are divided. Or about the workers who lose their jobs when an industry moves to another country. Ricardo also developed a version of the labor theory of value, the idea that the value of a good depends, ultimately, on the amount of labor needed to produce it. This idea would be inherited by another thinker with consequences Ricardo could not have imagined. Thomas Malthus was an Anglican clergyman. In 1798 he published an essay that would make him famous and hated in equal measure. His thesis was simple and terrifying: population grows geometrically, but food production grows arithmetically. That is, the population doubles, but the food does not. The logical conclusion was that humanity was doomed to recurrent cycles of famine, disease, and war that would cut the population back until it fit within the available resources once more. Malthus was not inventing anything particularly original. But he stated it with relentless clarity. And for a time, the data seemed to prove him right. The Industrial Revolution had not yet unleashed its potential to multiply food production. The most obvious criticism of Malthus is that he was wrong. Agricultural technology advanced far faster than he foresaw. Fertilizers, mechanization, and the Green Revolution of the 20th century fed billions of people who, according to Malthus, should have starved to death. But before dismissing Malthus, it is worth remembering two things. First, being wrong about the timing does not mean being wrong about the logic. The planet's resources are finite. The question of whether technology can always compensate for growing demand remains open. Second, Malthus still influences current economic thinking. The entire field of ecological economics and the debate over the limits to growth owe him something. Jean-Baptiste Say, a French economist, added another piece to the classical edifice. His law of Say, formulated in the early 19th century, states, greatly simplified, that supply creates its own demand. When you produce something, you generate income for workers, suppliers, and investors, and those incomes are spent, creating demand for other products. If Say's law is true, prolonged recessions are impossible. Any imbalance is temporary. The market corrects itself. This idea dominated economics for more than 100 years. Until the Great Depression arrived and a British economist demolished it. But that will be in another episode. John Stuart Mill closed the classical era. The son of economist James Mill, he was a child prodigy educated with an intensity that bordered on cruelty. He learned Greek at 3. Read the classics at 7. And suffered a nervous breakdown at 20 that forced him to rethink everything. Mill systematized classical economics in his Principles of Political Economy of 1848. But he also pushed it in new directions. He distinguished between the laws of production, which he considered natural, and the laws of distribution, which he considered social and therefore changeable. That is, the market produces wealth according to fixed laws, but how that wealth is divided is a human decision. It is a distinction that remains relevant today. And one that would open the door to debates the purer classicals would rather not have had. Classical economics built the foundations of the discipline. Some of its ideas still stand 200 years later. Comparative advantage. The division of labor. Coordination through prices. These are powerful analytical tools that no later school has discarded entirely. But the classicals also had enormous blind spots. First, they assumed markets tend toward equilibrium. That recessions are brief and the economy self-regulates. The Great Depression of 1929 would prove that this is not always true. Second, they did not pay enough attention to distribution. Ricardo saw that landowners, capitalists, and workers had different interests. But the classicals generally assumed that growth would eventually benefit everyone. Historical experience shows that this is not automatic. Third, they treated economics as a science of universal laws, when in reality many of their conclusions depended on the specific institutional assumptions of 19th century England. And fourth, the labor theory of value, which both Smith and Ricardo defended in different versions, was a ticking time bomb. If the value of things depends on the labor needed to produce them, what happens when the person who does the work receives less than what their labor is worth? A young German, exiled in London, reading Ricardo in the British Museum Library, found exactly that crack. And he turned it into a theory that split the world in two. The classical economists lived in a world undergoing profound transformation. The Industrial Revolution was pulling millions of people out of the countryside and putting them in factories. Cities were growing at brutal speed. Wealth was multiplying. And so was misery. Smith wrote about the welfare of nations, not the welfare of the rich. Ricardo worried about workers' wages. Mill championed women's rights when that was unthinkable. But their tools had limits. They saw the big aggregates but did not always see the individuals. They knew trade creates wealth, but they did not always ask who keeps it. That question was inherited by the schools that came after. And the answer, as we will see, depends on whom you ask. 3 ideas to take away from this episode. First, Adam Smith did not say greed is good. He said that self-interest, channeled through competitive markets, can coordinate a complex economy. But he also warned against monopolies and unchecked corporate power. Second, Ricardo discovered comparative advantage, the basis of international trade. But his labor theory of value contained a seed that would germinate in unexpected ways. Third, the classicals built the foundations of economics as a discipline. Their tools remain useful. But they assumed markets self-regulate, that crises are temporary, and that growth benefits everyone. All 3 assumptions would be challenged again and again. The classicals built economics as a discipline. But one reader of Ricardo saw something in the system they described. Something dark. Where Ricardo saw natural laws, he saw exploitation. Where Say saw equilibrium, he saw inevitable crises. Where Mill saw progress, he saw a machine that devoured the workers who made it run. His name was Karl Marx. And that, next time.